Hey guys, it's Mr. Barnett. Long time no see. It's been a while. We're starting a new chapter today. This is chapter 28. We're going to be talking about the Vietnam era. As always, just let me give you a couple of reminders. As always, please make sure you're taking notes. This isn't just for you to refer back to, which can be super helpful, especially when we do the reviews, but it's also to give you an opportunity to get those extra repetitions in your mind so you can remember this stuff better. It's important, the stuff that's underlined, so make sure you write that down. The other stuff is all optional, as always. So let's go ahead and get started. So the Cold War, if you remember, we talked about this in our last couple of chapters. The Cold War was basically the disagreement between two major world powers on ideas, right? We're disagreeing on how to form a government and how to form an economy. And that really boils over into a lot of other problems. But because of these disagreements, both sides build up huge military strength and they both start to influence other countries around them that cause a lot of drama. President Kennedy came into the presidency at this time period. He wanted to use what he called a three-part flexible response. Basically, he wanted to be able to respond to different kinds of problems in different ways because you don't always use the same tool for the same job, right? And so he wanted to be able to have options to respond to certain things in certain ways that would make sense for that situation. So he did this in three major ways. One, he wanted to have nuclear weapons in case the Soviets decide to use nuclear weapons, right? We want to be able to respond in that way if we have to, but really that's a deterrent. They're trying to keep the Soviets from using those same weapons. He also wanted to build up non-nuclear weapons. So this would be like tanks and airplanes and all kinds of stuff like that that he could use in situations that didn't require nuclear weapons, you know, intervening in third world countries, for example, or defending ourselves from terrorism, things like that. And then he wanted to support third world countries. Remember, the third world countries are those that are poor, they're non-industrial for the most part, they're trying to advance, and he wants to support them so that they side with us instead of siding with the Soviet Union. And here's Kennedy. By the way, Kennedy's the reason that Dora the Explorer's name makes sense. I don't know if you've heard that bit before, but everybody always wonders why, like, Dora the Explorer doesn't even rhyme. It does when you're Robert Kennedy. Dora the Explorer. Good times, good times. Anyway, so Kennedy's first big problem was how to deal with Cuba. Cuba had been pro-American up until about the mid-1950s when Fidel Castro, who was a college student at the time, actually overthrew the government. He overthrew the government in 1958 and set up a communist government with him as the dictator. This, of course, made our relationship with Cuba go downhill really, really, really quickly. Here's Fidel Castro. Interesting factoid here. It's almost impossible to find a picture of this dude without a cigar, just so you know. So here's one. He's laughing about us trying to kill him. So one of the big plans, remember, Eisenhower had actually been planning this. They had taken exiles from Cuba, people who had to flee when Fidel Castro took power because they were afraid he was going to kill them. And they came to the United States, largely to Florida. And Eisenhower actually took these men, trained them, gave them weapons, and said that basically we'd be using them soon to try and take back Cuba. JFK continued those plans and then actually initiated the operation. So on April 17th of 1961, we sent about 1,500 Cuban exiles to a place called the Bay of Pigs. Now, it's just a funny name. I get it. Get over it. It's fine. Within basically 3 days, all 1,500 of these exiles are either killed or captured. This invasion fails horribly. One big problem with this was that Castro already knew about the plot, so he was prepared for it. And we expected when we invaded that the Cuban people would overthrow Fidel Castro, right? They would help these exiles to overthrow the evil dictator. But for the people at that time, Fidel Castro had actually done some good for them. And so nobody joined the cause of the exiles and helped them. They actually turned them in. And we didn't provide air support that could have helped because we didn't want to make it seem even more obvious that we helped them. I mean, these boats full of men come from Florida and invade, but we didn't want anyone to think it was us. So kind of silly. Hey, look, Fidel Castro without a cigar. What do you know? That picture does exist. It's because he's in a tank. That would be bad inside of the tank. After this Bay of Pigs debacle, Cuba and the Soviet Union became even closer allies, so it kind of backfired on us. They were already good friends, and then we drove Cuba even closer to the Soviet Union. They started trading very, very heavily with each other. And in 1962, we had actually had a U-2 bomber flying over Cuba. Remember, those are those big, those airplanes with the really wide wings that could fly super high with great cameras on them. And we started taking pictures of what we thought, and we were rightfully thought, was a nuclear missile site being constructed in Cuba. So this is what our photographs showed us, and we had people analyzing it and realizing, yep, this is them building a facility that could launch nuclear weapons at the United States, which is no bueno, as you might guess. So JFK, who was the president during this time, had some big problems to deal with. He was going to be dealing with Fidel Castro, one, but also the Soviet Union leader who was named Nikita Khrushchev. Basically, JFK was super angry at Khrushchev. He called up Khrushchev and tried to get him to back down and say, hey, don't send these nukes to Cuba or there's going to be problems. But Khrushchev was also mad at JFK because we'd actually recently built nuclear weapon sites in Turkey, which is just off of their border. And so he felt like he was doing exactly what we had done. Both sides were not very happy about this. This created a huge amount of drama. For a couple of weeks, the world was on edge waiting for somebody to push the big red button. They were just waiting for nuclear weapons to be launched back and forth. Drills were going down like crazy in the United States. It was panic for sure. JFK's first response to this, though, was actually to set up a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent Russian ships from coming in to give the Cubans the last components that they needed for these nuclear weapons. There was about 6 days of tension overall, where there were these two naval forces just staring down these barrels of guns at each other. Finally, though, after all this tension, we agreed with the Soviet Union to remove our nukes from Turkey in exchange for them not setting up nukes in Cuba. We actually never really acknowledged this, though. We didn't tell anybody like, oh yeah, we made this deal because we removed stuff from Turkey, because we didn't want to look bad. So we just said, yeah, we got the Soviets to back down. How about that? But both sides gave in a little bit. There's another area where we directly confronted the Soviet Union in Berlin. Remember, we were talking about how the two sides owned part of Berlin. They also owned part of Germany, right? But the Allied side, as you could say, the American part with the help of the British and the French, the part we controlled of Berlin was actually inside of East Germany, which was controlled by the Soviet Union. But people in the Soviet-controlled part of East Germany were suffering. Remember, the Soviet Union wanted to make Germany suffer after the end of World War II, and so they were not treating the people very well. Those people started to flee East Germany and try to escape into West Germany. The Soviet Union got pretty upset about this. They actually wanted the U.S. to do something about it and be like, hey, don't let these people into your part of Germany. And we basically said, well, they're trying to escape your terrible communism. What do you want us to do, right? And so we didn't do anything about it. So the Soviets basically overnight built this giant wall to basically close off West Berlin from the rest of East Germany, so they couldn't escape Berlin anymore. This became known as the Berlin Wall. Countries around the world, especially non-communist countries, protested this. They basically said that this was a terrible human rights travesty and it shouldn't happen. But despite all of the protests, this wall stayed up for about 30 years. Matter of fact, it didn't get torn down until I was a kid. And you think I'm super old, but I'm not that old. This is where my saying "Niet Niet Soviet" comes from, by the way, in case you didn't notice that down there at the bottom of that white section of the wall. There's graffiti sprayed on this. The graffiti didn't end up happening until the late 80s, early 90s, before the wall was torn down. So the Kennedy administration basically had confronted the Soviet Union in two key places, right? They'd refused to back down with both Cuba and the Berlin Wall. Both sides continued to build up huge military powers. But the big thing we also wanted to dominate the Soviet Union in is the space race. Remember, we were behind the Soviets. They had launched Sputnik into into space before we had launched anything and kept it up there at all. And so we were trying to catch up from a disadvantage here. But JFK actually went, and during a State of the Union address, he basically says, we're going to land a man on the moon before the end of this decade. And he hadn't told anybody at NASA about this or anything. He was just like, yeah, we're going to do this. And those poor NASA engineers at home were watching the same news as everyone else and probably had a mini heart attack when they heard this, like, wait, what? We're supposed to get a man on the moon in like 6 years? It's impossible, right? Well, they did it. But we were so far behind, though, that nobody thought it was possible. Everybody thought this was kind of just a brag from JFK. Like he was just being like, trying to make us look good, but it wasn't really a real promise. But he did actually give NASA the resources they needed to get there. We'd basically been behind in every race on this, but eventually, through a lot of hard work and a lot of science and a lot of smart people using their abilities, we actually did end up beating the Soviet Union to the moon. July 20th of 1969, we cut it to the wire. Remember, he wanted it done before the end of 1969. So we had a whole, 6 months to spare. Neil Armstrong was the first man to walk on the moon. I wish we could talk about the space race more because it is awesome, but there are literally dozens and dozens of documentaries you can watch that would do a much better job than I would anyway. So if you want to check some of those out, I think there's a bunch on, I was watching one on Disney Plus recently, actually. There's a photograph from that famous spacewalk. We're actually at war with the Soviet Union in a way here, but we actually didn't always try to dominate the Soviets. There were a few times that we actually tried to come to an agreement with them to try and mend bridges and be better friends. Two big things that Kennedy did during his presidency to accommodate with the Soviet Union was the deal to end the Cuban Missile Crisis. Remember, we removed our nukes from Turkey. They removed theirs from Cuba. And we actually began selling the Soviet Union something that they desperately needed, which was food, especially wheat. Wheat is great because it lasts a long time. Like you can store it for a long time. It's relatively cheap to transport. So we actually sold a bunch to the Soviet Union to keep their citizens alive when we could have just ignored their suffering and let them die. But Kennedy wasn't that kind of guy. He tried to help them out that way. And that's it for today. Remember, there is a homework assignment. You should be able to see it in the Google Classroom. Please do that in a Google Doc and then just attach it to the assignment inside of Google Classroom so I get one fewer email. I have been getting literally hundreds of emails a day. So if you can help me with that, that would be great. But make sure you get that homework done, and I will hopefully see you in real life sooner rather than later. But we'll have some more of these coming up the rest of this week. Awesome. Thanks, guys.